Small Changes by Digits 27, Chapter 35, Familiar Revelations. Ami stood across at the man in front of her, ravishly eating away at his skewered fish. It appeared that being a hermit did little for one's table manners. That, combined with her still fuzzy head and various body aches, was making her feel a little green, and her own fish on a stick went largely untouched. She used the opportunity instead to try and glean anything she could about her rescuer. His long, unruly hair made pinpointing his age a little difficult, but he was definitely older than her by maybe 5 or 6 years. He was handsome, as she had thought before, and for some reason a lot of his features reminded her of Sasuke. This, of course, led to her imagining said teammate with similarly long, messy hair, only to nearly choke on her mouthful from laughter. She couldn't imagine although he wouldn't admit it, to faint Uchiha Shiano with anything less than his perfect hair. The man was dressed rather plainly, and a lot of his clothes seemed to have heavily worn and patched, but she suspected hermits didn't have a lot of motivation to go clothes shopping. Speaking of which, she thought hermits were supposed to be old, antisocial grouches with too much about the world to complain about. This young man in front of her didn't seem the type. For one, he just seemed so carefree. There was an energy to his movements beyond the fact that Ami could definitely feel the chakra within him. It was surprisingly powerful, and even more shockingly, the only thing she could compare it to would be her sensei. So he finally spoke up, noticing her not eating her food and finishing up with his own. "What's going on in the world?" Seeing her blank look, he elaborated once again, scratching the back of his head in a way that was so infuriatingly Naruto. "Not a lot of news reaches this little part of the world," he smirked to himself as a chuckle escaped his lips. "Especially round my neck of the woods." He laughed, only too quiet, as Ami continued to stare at him blankly. "Oh, that would have been funnier if you knew we were in the woods," he stated lamely, only to look down and grumble at himself when Ami didn't give him so much as a smile. Nobody appreciates good humor anymore. Ami actually found herself sighing at the almost pathetic sight before her. No grown man should be moping around like that. "Is that why you became a hermit? To hone your comedy?" she offered dryly, throwing him a bone only to have him grin like a loon. "Amongst other things," he evaded, still grinning. "Now, come on. I think a bit of current affairs is the least you can do for dragging you out of that river." Ami sighed before shrugging. The man seemed harmless enough, and he had saved her. "Well, I suppose you mean aside from the war?" Upon seeing his raised eyebrows, she nearly dropped her fish in the fire. "You don't even know about the war?" He simply shrugged. "I don't think you quite understand just how far into nowhere we are, kid." Ami pointed at being called out a kid before sobering. "That's another thing. Where exactly am I?" She was surprised when the man procured a map from seemingly nowhere, and not just any map. "Hey, that's mine!" He shushed her, waving his hand at her potentially, before pointing vaguely at a position near the river she had drifted down. "Just about here, more or less." Ami scowled at the man before her expression became more thoughtful. She had drifted nearly half a kilometer away from the cliffs, but more pointedly from her teammates. She could only hope that she had bought them enough time to get away. "So, tell me about this war." The man spoke up, pulling her out of her worried thoughts and back into the present. "I assume Konoha is involved." Suddenly, Ami's muscles locked up as her entire form became defensive and suspicious. Immediately, the man raised his hands innocently. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, calm down. I saw your headband," he quickly placated, the offending item suddenly hanging from his hand. Amy quickly snatched the length of cloth and metal away from him, giving him a mean scowl giving him as mean a scowl as she could manage, with what felt like a half-dozed bruised ribs. "Stop stealing my stuff!" He just grinned innocently. "As a hermit, I prefer borrowing, hoping you wouldn't notice it was gone. It makes me come off a bit better, right?" His form seemed to slump a little when Ami just narrowed her eyes. "That's stealing," she muttered in irritation, only growing more annoyed when he shrugged nonchalantly. "Koi nai kun ai, same difference," he shot back with a disarming smile. After grumbling to herself for a few moments about hermits that couldn't respect personal property, she acquiesced. "Yeah, Konoha is at war with Kusa, Taki, and Oto," she admitted before remembering the circumstances that brought her here in the first place. "And Kumo." The man let a long whistle, looking at the wall of a cave for a moment with wide eyes. Damn, how did they manage that? That's the entire northern border. He didn't think Ame's eyes narrowed a little at the observation. Well, what else is going on in the world of Yurikonoichi, right? What's going on in Konoha? He asked, suddenly diverting the conversation. What does it matter to you? Ame jibbed, defensively nibbling at her fish as an excuse not to answer. I get curious about all you shinobi types, you know. All the stories fly around about you guys. He shot right back with a grin. When she didn't answer, he pressed a bit more. What about teammates? Sensei, must have been someone good for you to survive the injuries you had. It was more like a reflex at that point for her to shout. Of course, Naruto Sensei is good. He's going to be the next Hokage. In the heat of the moment, she didn't even notice the man's eye widen in visible shock. He has a team, he muttered, face cast into an expression of surprise, only to shake himself out of it when faced with Ami's curious and suspicious look. I mean, Naruto Namikaze has a team. Even out here, we get a lot of stories about that guy. From what I've heard, he didn't seem the type. Ami's eyes stayed narrowed as she took a bite from her fish, only to grimace. It had gone cold. Right, Ami drawled before her curiosity overcame her. So what exactly do you hear about Naruto-sensei? At that the man gained an embarrassed grin. Oh, you know, the usual stuff for your shinobi types. Daring deeds, amazing powers, fastest man alive, yada yada yada. He shrugged dastardly before leaning back against the cave wall, rubbing his stomach contentedly. Right, us shinobi types, Ami agreed slowly, finishing off her fish and placing it to the side. At least being a hermit seemed to do nothing to damper one's cooking skills. Anyway, I should be going. She shifted, finding that her various aches and pains so she wouldn't slow her down too much. He had done a good job on the bandaging. The man appeared to agree, nodding quickly as he lazily pushed himself to his feet. Right, right. Your teammates are probably worried anyway. When Ami directed a pointed gaze at him, he simply grinned. You shinobi do go about in teams, right? She only maintained the narrowed gaze at him for a moment before a twinge in her side forced her to look away. As she walked away, he waved to her from beside the fire, the dancing light washing out his features for a moment as his visible eyes seemed to flash red, but it was only for a moment, and Ami played it off as a trick of the light. See you, kid. Come back any time. My cave's always open. There was a pause before the man began to laugh again. Get it? Because it doesn't have a door? The violet simply stifled a groan and strode on, suddenly feeling rather happy to be getting away from the strange hermit. However, even as she walked, tracing her way back to the river to get her bearings, she considered some of the oddities she had noticed. First of all, he was able to read her map. It was encoded in a way only shinobi should have been able to decipher it. Then, he used both pronunciations of kunai. Civilians did not do that, not ones that she knew of. Finally, there was just something in the way he moved, with control and precision that non-shinobi just couldn't get naturally. However, the kicker came when she realized she had never even asked the man his name. That was unlike her. She had been trained to gather as much information as possible in any situation. Why had she ignored that training? She winced, blinking rapidly as she stumbled forward a step. She was trying to think back, to try and discern anything else she missed. However, even as she thought about it, it was becoming more and more difficult to even remember what the man had looked like. In the last bit, she turned on her heel and jogged back the way she came, or at least she thought it was the way she came. For some reason, she couldn't find the cave again, but she had only taken a few steps out of it. Right? In fact, what was she looking for again? She couldn't remember, at least until the sound of water reached her ears. Right, the river. She had been looking for the river to find her bearings. She needed to get back to her teammates. Shaking her head of the weird fuzziness that seemed to be clouding her thoughts, she set a determined look on her features and ran off upstream. She winced as her injuries protested the movements, but she had done a good enough job bandaging herself up that she was confident she'd make it back to Konoha. The man watched silently from a nearby tree as Ami seemed to fight with herself before finally rushing off in the direction of the river. When she finally left his vision, he nodded to himself once before cracking his neck and dropping to the forest floor. She had been a good source of information, the type of person he imagined he would get on well with. It was a shame. She actually reminded him quite a bit of him. Damn tomato head, you were supposed to take care of things while I was gone, only to go and throw yourself into a war. He sighed, glancing up at the sky and scratching the back of his head before letting out a long exhale. I suppose it's time I stopped hiding, huh? He looked back to his cave and groaned. So much good food was going to go to waste. when I had just gotten good at being a hermit too. His groan quickly flipped to a grin, so fast it was though some invisible switch had been pulled. Oh well, time to see how much you guys screwed up the world without me. He chuckled as he adjusted his Oni mask so that his single Sharingan eye blazed steadily through the single eye hole, walking with silent footsteps out into the forest. Honestly, got to do everything myself. Nato stared at the full sake bottle sitting in front of him, just stared at it as he rested his head on one hand. The couch he was sitting on was his favorite as a child, sitting in his mother's lap as she tried to knit some abomination she called clothing, or listening with rapt attention as his father would regale him with stories of shinobi, past and present. He didn't feel so comfortable now, not with the weight that seemed to have settled over his shoulders. The only reason he hadn't touched the bottle yet was because a large part of him refused to believe Ame was actually dead. He only drank two memories, and Ame was no memory, not yet. Hell, Anko had been MIA for months before they had found her. He wasn't one to give up so easily. That wouldn't make telling Anko or heaven help him Yujiao or any easier though, so when he heard footsteps, he immediately swiveled in place, catching Uncle off guard as she paused at the foot of the stairs, clad in nothing but an oversized shirt. Oh, hey Naruto, what was up with last night anyway? You dumped that girl off on me without warning, then just ran off? Naruto found his words catching in his throat as he watched her suddenly shake her head and an excited gleam entering her eyes. Anyway, that doesn't matter. You'll never guess what, she exclaimed brightly. Uncle, she struggled to find the words for a moment. Ami had been like a little sister to Uncle. I need to tell you something. However, he was suddenly cut off as Uncle sprung forward, pressing a finger to his lips with a predatory grin. Me first. She grinned, taking a few swirling steps backwards. She seemed a whole lot bubblier than normal. Finally, she composed herself before taking a deep breath and brightly exclaiming, I'm pregnant. And just like that, Naruto's entire world ground to an abrupt halt, his words dying on the tip of his tongue. Yeah, you're. He just about managed, quickly earning a happy nod from Uncle. In fact, he had never seen her quite so ecstatic, and there really was no other word for it. Uh-huh. She beamed brightly. He couldn't tell if it was from the news or if she was just enjoying the dumbfounded expression on his face. I'm going to be a father. That was the one singular thought that was running around his head, as if on loop. However, when he finally voiced it, he couldn't quite believe his own ears. Yep, Uncle nodded helpfully again, her grin only stretching even further across her cheeks somehow. A dad, he managed again, quite eloquently as he would later recall. Mm-hmm, Uncle agreed, seemingly losing amusement in his reaction at this point. It didn't seem to matter as much though when the gears in Naruto's head finally clicked together and meshed. His eyes brightened at the same moment. He rushed forward, grabbing Uncle around the waist, picking her up and suddenly spinning her around him. We're going to be parents. The joy was practically palpable in his voice, all other thoughts suddenly vanishing from his mind. He was going to have a son, or daughter, or twins. The thought briefly made him gulp before his previous happiness washed over him again. Hako seemed just as excited as he was, grabbing him tightly and wrapping her legs around his waist as she pulled him in for a searing kiss. A million thoughts rushed through Naruto's mind as they just stood there, absorbed in each other's presence. However, when they finally separated, Naruto's eye caught a picture frame on a nearby table. It was of him as a young child, his arms draped around the neck of his parents as they hoisted him between them. Cold reality came crashing down on him in the wake of his euphoria. He was going to be a father. There would be a tiny, fragile little life that would depend on him and Uncle completely. He was going to be bringing a life into the world, into this world, a world of war and pain and loss. Right at that moment, as his expression hardened and his eyes became icy with determination, he vowed to himself that he would always be there for his child, no matter what. Nothing would ever tear his family apart. Nothing. Not again. Uncle seemed to sense his sudden shift, pulling back with a concerned frown. Is everything okay? Snapped back into the present by her shaking voice. He quickly realized how he might have worried her and smiled warmly. He pulled her closer and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead before wrapping her up and simply holding her against him for a long few seconds. Everything's fine, or at least it will be. He pulled back away from her and began to move upstairs, Uncle rushing after him. "Where are you going?" she called from the bottom of the stairs, causing the redhead to turn and look down at her from the landing. "Don't worry, there's just something I have to do real quick." He smiled disarmingly. "I'll be back in time to share a drink." He paused, glancing down at her stomach quickly. "To celebrate with you." With that, he turned and swept into his office, causing Uncle to pout as she moved herself back over to the couch and plopped herself down, arms crossed under her chest in a huff. When she saw him again, it was in a bright red flash as he reappeared in the hallway, already making for the door. "Where are you going now?" she demanded from her place, leaning over the back of the couch. He simply waved a hand at her, already striding at the door. "Be right back. I'm going to go end the war before it starts," he shouted back in an indecipherable tone. Uncle just huffed before blinking as she remembered something. "Hey, what was the thing you wanted to tell me?" she called out too late as the door slammed shut. The scratch of a pen on paper broke the shallow silence of a small, hidden grove just south of the border between Kaminari and Shimo. A dark-skinned bulk of a man dressed in a heavily modified version of the Kumakakura uniform sat on a log to one side. His sunglasses-covered face was screwed up in concentration as he mused out loud, writing in a tiny notebook ever so often. "Yo, yo, that's my flow, you know." He paused, fingers against his chin as he stared at the page before frowning and quickly scratching it out. "Nah, man, that's amateur stuff. Not worth of the killer bee. Yeah." His ears perked up as someone else suddenly invaded his little sanctuary. A tall red-haired man he had never seen before but looked oddly familiar. "What's up, my man? You come with a plan? Are you here to see the one and only killer bee? Those autographs ain't free, yeah, man." The man stopped, an eyebrow quirking in what might have been amusement if his expression wasn't so otherwise serious. "Sorry, not here for an autograph." It was then that the light caught the man's headband, tied around his bicep over the rolled-up sleeves of his joining uniform. "You're Killer B, right? The brother of the Yondam Raikage." The man in question simply grinned as he launched himself to his feet, quickly pocketing the little notebook. "The one and only of the legendary A and B." The man simply observed the muscle-bound man for a few more moments before nodding to himself. "All right." The next few things happened faster than most would have been able to follow, but it culminated in Naruto pressing his wind-infused Tonto up against the two crossed swords, practically buzzed with electricity as Killer Bee held him back, muscles visibly straining from the sudden assault. Before Naruto knew what hit him, he was sent flying back across the clearing, only to flip and land on his feet. He faintly saw something pink slip back behind Killer Bee, but wasn't sure what it was. "Whoa, man, you gotta chill out. I ain't sure what this is all about. In order to clear this fog, we gotta start up a dialogue with..." Killer Bee rapped quickly as Naruto shot towards him again, Tonto drawn and shimmering with vicious green energy. The man was visibly nervous as he dodged back from the initial swing, deflecting the next, and ducking under the third. When he swung back up from a vicious uppercut, Naruto simply flashed to the other side of the clearing. It had only taken Killer Bee the initial burst of high-speed movement for him to recognize the bloody flash from the bingo book. "Why is a guy like the big bad Flash wanting to go all smash and crash? Fool, you fool." He started up during the brief reprieve, only to have the redhead glare at him. "I didn't start this. I'm just ending what your brother started before anyone else dies. Unfortunately, I need you to do that. We might have been friends under better circumstances." With that, he flashed forwards again. However, in the dull combat, he gave Killer Bee time to collect himself and suddenly found the air around the man littered with swords, 7 in all, in obviously well-practiced and deceptively ridiculous movements. The Kumo Jinchuriki caught them all across various places in his body. It gave him the look of a metal porcupine, with them all sticking out at all angles. "Oh man, what's Big Bo done now? I pack a sabbatical and he goes and sparks a raw." Kirby grumbled through the sword held in his mouth. Naruto eyed him hesitantly for a few moments. The sword style may have looked laughable, but the way the man held himself spoke of countless hours in training. The number of blades all alone made him cautious enough to sheath his Tonto and instead bring out 2 of his kunai. Something told him he would need the extra maneuverability. Surprisingly, it was Killer Bee who made the first move, launching himself forward right at the redhead with considerable speed, well above a normal jonin at least. There was a reason he was considered the second strongest man in Kumakakure. That didn't matter though. If Naruto couldn't defeat him, then nothing he was doing right now would matter. So instead, he dived right at him, kunai shrieking with energy and eyes darting about frantically at each of the swords, keeping track of them all in their high-speed frenzy. Killer Bee was genuinely surprised at the first ever opponent to rush him, especially considering his veritable buzzsaw of a body. That moment of ever so slight hesitation cost him as Naruto suddenly appeared within his guard, somehow managing to parry three different blades at once with his two kunai. What looked like a fourth, although Killer Bee knew that to be impossible, suddenly struck out at him. He leaned his head to the side and only received a light scratch all along his cheek for the trouble, or he thought so until he heard something snap and his vision became considerably lighter. My shades, he lamented softly as his sunglasses fell to the ground in two pieces. His dark eyes narrowed instantly. Yo, man, now it's personal. Anyone that knew him personally would have been surprised when he stopped rapping and understood just how serious he had become. His limbs suddenly came in as a blur of wire blue light as his swords appeared to multiply right before Naruto's eyes. Suddenly, the air around the two became a maelstrom of steel, lightning, and displaced air. There were no openings in the man's guards, and the sheer number of weapons he was able to bring to bear at dizzying angles actually managed to go a long way in neutralizing whatever advantage Naruto's superior speed and reflexes would have given him. It was stalemated for them. Naruto could block, parry, or divert all of the man's attacks, but land none of his own. At this rate, it was becoming a battle of attrition, and between the containers of the Hachibi and Kyubi, that was going to be a very, very long battle of attrition. Suddenly, Naruto dived backwards to escape the melee of sharp steel, hands already cycling through seals. When released, shearing gale, as he exhaled 5 long scythes of lethally sharp wind laced out at Killer Bee, forcing the man to bring around 5 of his blades to destroy them. But then, the plan was never for the jutsu to hit. The millisecond Naruto's feet touched the solid ground, he was already pushing chakra through his toes. He rocketed forward in a blur of red, light on the tail of his own technique. His eyes tracked Killer Bee's weapon, 5 of them locked down and defending against his technique. One of them was in the crook of his right knee, behind the man and useless. The last was suddenly knocked out from his mouth as Naruto flicked his wind and hands kunai at hit. The prongs of the small blade catching the Tsutsaba and wrenching it out from the Jinchuriki's teeth. Suddenly, Killer Bee found himself staring at the business end of Naruto's knee in what was sure to be a move that would knock him out or at least disorientate him, with no humane way to defend against it in time. Naturally, Naruto's surprise was immense then as he suddenly found what looked to be an eighth sword interposed between Killer Bee and himself. It forced him to bring around his kunai to prevent his head being cleanly separated from his shoulders. The two clashed in a content of strength that, with his superior build and Naruto's lack of leverage in the air, Killer Bee quickly won, flinging the redhead back across the clearing. Man, Mr. Nine, that move was too damn fine, you fool! Killer Bee exclaimed energetically now that his mouth was free, the previous insult against his shades apparently forgotten in his excitement. Naruto quickly grasped why his plan had failed, as he saw a long grayish ink octopus tentacle holding a sword defensively in front of Killer Bee, apparently the very same one he had knocked out of the man's mouth. It emerged from the man's back but quickly slithered back after replacing the displaced sword. I say I got a mop up a few papers. The Kumo Shinobi shouted once again, muffled by the hilt he was biting. However, Naruto didn't get to ponder the ludicrousness of the situation as a foul pressure began to invade the air. A familiar and noxious chakra began to bubble up from Killer Bee's skin, finally enveloping the man in a sickly orange layer of surprisingly crisp and controlled Biju chakra. 4 tails waved lazily behind him as he grinned through the sword in his teeth. Let's see how you handle dish, he grumbled in a mildly distorted voice before rocketing forward at alarming speeds, the ground cratering in his wake. Naruto's reflexes easily moved his body to the side. Killer Bee was still slower than him. However, the lance of pure energy was a bit harder to dodge, and he was rewarded with a light burn across his arm. Despite being a Jinchuriki himself, Naruto had never had all that much exposure to his own Biju's chakra. That stuff would be just as dangerous to him as it would be to others. Perhaps not toxic, but just as damaging. They had grown tired of engaging the Jinchuriki directly anyways, quickly throwing out a handful of kunai that rapidly multiplied into 50 with a few well-placed hand seals. Before Killer Bee knew what hit him, the tables had been turned yet again, and he was swiftly assaulted by what looked to be an army of feet appearing out of red flashes that were gone before they were even fully visible. Even covered in Biju chakra, the sustained assault, with no way to block it, couldn't be endured for long. With a roar that shook the trees around them, Naruto was suddenly blasted back by a surge of particularly dense and foul chakra. In the center of it all stood Killer Bee, swords gone only to be replaced by 8 blood-red appendages of pure energy. Instead of the semi-translucent coverage the four-tailed states had provided, Killer Bee was now shrouded in an opaque red layer that looked more like blood than anything else. Naruto didn't get a lot of time to admire it though, as suddenly the chakra-shrouded beast was blasted towards him, creating a small shockwave from his speed. One arm was outstretched, and in a blink, a full ox skull imposed itself across the bicep that was level with Naruto's neck. Lariat was all Naruto heard as he bent his neck back, allowing the charging man to pass straight over him. He was glad he didn't attempt to halt the raging Jinchuriki as it took around 4 trees to finally halt his movements. He turned, revealing soulless white voids that seemed to ask for eyes and a mouth pass for eyes and a mouth full of jagged, misaligned things that Naruto supposed were teeth. He sighed before cracking his neck, settling back into a loose, comfortable stance as he motioned at the transformed Killer Bee with one hand. Mistake number 1. Fighting a seal master as a massive chakra. Killer Bee seemed to grin at that, although it was hard to tell. With a grunt, he lined up for another charge. What passed for a muscle in his strange form tensing. With a growl, he shot off again, this time even faster as the ox skull created velocity rings in its wake. Mistake number 2, Naruto called out as he spun to the side at the last moment, allowing the charging beast to fly right by him unscathed. Giving up the advantage your blade gave you. Killer Bee snorted angrily at that, looking even more the picture of a bull facing a matador. He never even noticed Naruto's smirk as the Namikaze ushered himself forward once again. And mistake number 3, Killer Bee noticed the gleam in the redhead's eyes when it was already too late and he was a few feet away, unable to halt his own movements, thinking this clone was actually me. Boom! The explosion that followed rent the trees around the clearing back violently, sending smoke and ash high in the sky that could be seen for miles around. It was enough to say that Naruto had not held back on Killer Bee's account. Matori was, for all intents and purposes, having a fairly boring day. Despite guarding one of Kumakakure's more entrenched camps, nothing was happening and likely wouldn't for a while. They were in the tundra of Shimonokuni, right on the border with Kaminari, where it was just far enough away to not be home, but certainly cold enough to feel like it. He watched the campfire flicker pathetically, not really holding up against the snowy winds all that well. For a second, he could have sworn the fire turned red for just a moment, but passed it off, or at least he did until he noticed the sudden silence that had descended over the camp. He looked up only to see a man standing right in the middle of the clearing. At his feet, a very recognizable kunai. It wasn't just any man, though. It was a man most would recognize as quickly climbing his way to a flea on sight order in the bingo books. Slung over his arms was the man all the Kumo shinobi would recognize, even in the most bruised and bloody state, which was good because he wasn't far off from it. Naruto threw Killer Bee down roughly, placing a foot on his back and his tanto dangerously close to the Hachibi Jinchuriki's neck, so much so that the fluctuating wind chakra actually sliced the paper-thin line into his skin. He glanced around at the assembled shinobi pointedly, as if summoning them up with his gaze alone. One of you go message Uraikage, tell him the Gondam Hokage wants to talk to him. End of chapter 35.